Hey guys! So today we're going to work on making our crops persistent across different rooms. So at the moment when we leave our farm room and then we come back, we can see that all of our crops get deleted because all objects in a room are deleted when the room ends. So we're going to change that. We're going to set up a system where our crops sort of master object is going to save all of our individual crops data when the room ends, and then it will respawn them when we re-enter the farm room. And I just want to quickly point something out. You might be wondering why we're not just using the persistent check right here. Some of our master system objects, like the crops and game objects, we've used it to make them persistent, so why can't we do that for our crops? Well, if we do that, this will make our crops persist over all of the rooms. So if we make a crop and then we go into another room, we'll see our crop sitting right there in the location that we planted it in the farm room, and that's not what we want. So we could make them invisible when it's not in the farm room, but that would still mean the object is still existing and still running code and taking up resources, so that's not good either. We could also just deactivate the instance if we're not in the room, but still it just seems way too messy to leave objects there when they just don't have to be. We can just save their data at the end of the room and delete them as normal and respawn them when we're in the farm room. So as you might be anticipating, we're going to be using another grid to save the crops data, and we'll call this just ds crops data. So now we've got ds crops types, ds crops instances, and ds crops data. Those are our three grid data structures. So our new grid data structure is going to store 4 different things about the crop. So it's going to have a width of 4. So for every single crop, we're going to save their position in the instance grid. And remember, so the instance grid is that grid that's breaking up our farm into a grid of 32 by 32 pixels. So we're going to save its X and Y grid location in these first 2 columns. And then we're going to save the crop's crop type, because when we're respawning the crop, we need to know what crop to actually respawn. And then finally, we're going to tell it how old the crop is. So that way, once we've respawned it at this location, this type of crop, and this many days old, it should look exactly the same as the crop that we destroyed when we left the room. So basically at the end of the room, we loop through all of our crops in the instance grid and we add all of their data to this new data grid. So every row will represent a new crop. Then when we re-enter the farm room, we loop through this grid and we respawn all of the crops, and we pass them all of their data from this grid, like their crop type and how old they are. So the first thing we're going to do is come to our crops object and create event, and we're going to create our data grid. So we're going to call this ds crops data, and we're actually just going to create it right here, ds grid create 4 and 1. And then what we're going to just do is we're going to clear the grid to -1. And what this does is it sets all of the cells in this grid to be equal to a certain value. And in this case, I'm setting it to -1. And this is kind of going to be denoting that our data grid is completely empty and we haven't saved any crops data. Alright, and the next thing we're going to do is we'll set up saving the crops at the end of the room. So we're going to go to the room end event, and we're going to have, so if our room is equal to room farm, because remember the room end event is running at the end of every single room, but we only want to do this, we only want to save all the data if we're in the farm room. So first we're checking that, and then what we're going to do is, again, we're just going to have a little check for whether there's actually any crops in the room, because again, no point doing anything if there's 0 crops in the room, and we're going to be needing the number of crops anyway. So we're going to set up a variable called instance number of obj crop. So this will get the number of obj crop instances in our room. So, and then we say if there is none, so if inst num is equal to 0, then there's no data here, but otherwise there is crops, so save their data. So let's say we entered the farm room and there was crops in the room, but then we went ahead and we destroyed all of the crops, like we picked them or something, and then we went and left the room. So that means our data grid will have some data in it. And now we leave the room and it's time to save the crops data, but there is none. So what we have to do is we kind of have to overwrite all of the previous stuff and just get rid of it all. So we're going to basically reset it. So we're going to go ds grid, and we're just going to clear it again so that all the cells have -1. All right. But if we do have some crops in the room, then let's go ahead and we're going to save it. So first, we have to resize our grid. So the data grid is going to be at different heights, depending on how many crops are in the room. Remember, each row of the grid is going to be denoting a different crop. And so the grid's height is actually just going to be equal to the instance number. So we can go ds grid resize, the data grid. So its width is just going to be whatever the width previously was. So we could just put in 4, like we put here, but Again, we might change that later, so I'm just going to say get whatever the current width is and set it to that again. So ds grid. And then the height is going to be inst num, however many instances there are. Okay. And now we're going to loop through the instance grid. And by this grid, remember this is the grid that is breaking up the room into the 32 by 32 cells, right? So we're basically going to check that entire grid. We're going to loop through it. And if a cell contains an instance, then we're going to save its data. So to do this, we kind of have to go check each spot like horizontally across the grid and go through it one cell by one every single time. And we're going to use the same logic as we have in the past. So we need some information about the grid first. So we're going to set up some variables again. So we're going to set up the grid width. So this is going to be grid width of the instance grid and the height. And I'm also going to set up a variable called slot. This is going to be the sort of row that this instance is going to be in our data grid. So it's slotting in the grid. So we're going to start at 0 because the first one will just be in slot 0. Okay, so now we loop through the instance grid. So var xx equals 0, and then so we basically repeat, and the number of times we're repeating will be the width of the instance grid because we're going across all of the x positions in the grid, and then we go across all of the y positions in the grid, and we keep going through the entire grid like that. And every time we loop through an x position, we also loop through the y. And every single time we're doing any of that, we increment by 1. Okay, so every time at every slot of our instance grid, what we're going to check is there an instance at this location of the grid? So ds crops instances xxyy. And then we're going to say if there is an instance in the cell, save its data. So we go if inst does not equal 0, because remember, when we create a crop, it slots in its instance ID to our instance grid. So we're checking if it's not 0, then that means there is something there, and we're going to save its data. 4 things about it. So we're going to have ds crops data. So in the first row, we have to save its position in the grid. So the x coordinate for the data grid, this will always just be 0 because this is the column for the grid x. But what is the y going to be? And that's just going to be whatever place it's slotting it into. So it's going to be whatever this value is currently equal to. So we'll say slot, and then when this is all done, what we'll do down the very bottom here is we'll increase slot for the next instance. So in this spot, we're going to save its current x position in the grid, and this will just be equal to whatever xx currently is because we're looping through this whole grid. So xx will be equal to whatever cell of the grid we're currently in. And we do the same for the y. So now we're saving what crop type it is. So this is the third column. This is actually column 2 because we're starting at 0. So now we're just going to get whatever the crop type of our instance is. So we can just go inst.croptype. And finally, we are saving how many days old the instance is. All right, there we go. So we've saved the crops data. That is all we need to do. And now finally, I know we've kind of moved some of this stuff around a little bit in the previous video, but I'm actually going to make another change to how we're storing the instances grid. Once we have done all of this, the instance grid itself, which is just saving whatever crops are currently in the room, because the room is ending and we're going to leave the room and we don't need the data anymore, I'm actually just going to destroy it. And we're going to actually be recreating it at the start of every single room. So I'm also just going to take it out of this and delete that event and put this into the game end. And while we're here, actually, we should add our new grid, the ds crops data, into the game end so that we are destroying our data structure when the game ends. Okay, so that's that for saving the data. So we get the number of crops, we resize the data grid to that number of crops, we loop through the instances grid to see what was in the room. If we find any instances at particular points in the room, then we go ahead and we save their data to the data grid, and then we go and destroy the instance grid because we don't need it anymore. But the data grid will persist because when we re-enter the room, we're going to need to access it again. Whereas the ds crops instances just needs to be there in the room when we're in it. So save the data. Now we have to respawn all the crops. So let's go to the room start, and we're going to change this a little bit. So we can get rid of this, but we still need this condition for checking if we are actually in just the farm room because we're not going to be respawning anything otherwise. So if we're in the farm room, then that's fine. We go ahead and we create that crop grid. And what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to make sure that all of these slots, when I'm recreating the grid, are equal to 0. It should be when you make a new grid, but sometimes you can get weird artifacts in data structures. So I'm just going to make sure that they are all 0, and we're going to clear it again because our grid is going to have some empty spots. All right, so now we're going to respawn the crops. Firstly, we're going to just check if there's actually anything in the crops data. And the way we're going to tell if there's not is if you remember when we have created it for the first time and there's nothing in it, we set it all of the cells to -1. And we also did that in the room end here if we found that there was no instances. And I've set it to -1 because -1 should never be coming up for any of these cases, right? It shouldn't ever be located at a negative spot in the X or Y axis. There are no crop types that have an index of -1, and it can't be a negative number of days old. So basically, we can just check any cell of the grid, and if it's equal to -1, then we know that we haven't saved over any of the data. So I'm just going to check if ds crops data, and we'll just check the first cell. And so if it's not equal to -1, then we know that there is data saved. So that means we can go ahead and we can respawn whatever is in there. So let's get how many instances there are again. So let's set up inst num ds grid height of ds crops data. And basically what we're going to do is, so for however many instances there are, we're going to kind of loop through all of them and we're going to respawn that instance. And to do that, we're actually going to create another script just to make things a little bit neater. And I'm going to call this script respawn crop. And let's add in our description for it. So description respawn crop. So it takes in the grid X position, the grid Y, and the number of days old. So back here, so starting at slot 0, we loop through it and go through all of these slots and hand over all of these values. We're going to respawn the crop. And I'm going to write it out over a few lines because otherwise this is going to take up a lot of space. And remember to put this at the end of your repeat statement so that every time you're repeating, slot is getting incremented. So we're going through all of the slots in the grid. So for the first argument, and you can see our arguments are coming up here, although that one isn't for some reason. It should be. There we go. All right, so the first one we give it is the grid X, which we can just access by going ds crops data. And we know this is going to be in the first row, which is row 0. So we go 0, and then the Y position is just going to be whatever the slot is currently equal to, right? So that's the first argument, and then our second argument. And we can just copy paste this for all of the other arguments, and then just change all of these. All right. And it's just kind of complaining right now because we haven't written the script to be using our arguments. So let's go do that. Let's go write our script. So similar to our instance create crop grid, but we don't have to check all of these tile things and everything because we should have already done that. So whatever location it's telling us to respawn, it should be fine. So we're going to instance create layer, and we will recreate a crop. Now remember, so the argument that we've been given here is the grid position, but we have to convert that back to pixels for when we're respawning it. So we can't just put argument 0 for this one because we have to basically change it by whatever our cell size is. So I'm going to set up a couple variables here to calculate that. So we're going to have XX and YY, and this is going to be argument 0 times the cell size. And we can use this variable because remember the context of this script, we should be in the crops object. So we should be able to access the cell size variable because that's where we set it up. All right, and we do the same for the Y. So now we can just put XX and YY, except that's not quite right either because we want it in the middle of the cell, if you remember. So we have to add half of the cell size to these variables. So let's go plus cell size over 2. Okay, and finally, so the layer that we're creating it to, which is just the instances layer, and then the type of object, which is obj crop. All right, so we have made a crop at the right location, but now we have to alter its characteristics. Let's save its ID in a variable so that we can change some of its characteristics. And I'm just going to make this a bit bigger. There we go. And so we're going to give the crop its characteristics. So we're going to go with our instance, and we're going to set its crop type. So what this will be, whatever this is set to, and this is argument number 2, because we go 0, 1, 2. So argument 2, and how many days old it is, argument 3. And then finally, the last thing it's going to need is, if you recall our crops, they have a growth stage duration that is defaulted to 0, and we have to set that up for it as well. So we're going to change growth stage duration, and that is actually just saved in our crop type grid that we created quite a few episodes ago. But remember, so we're with the instance right now, so we can't just access the crop type grid because it belongs to the crops object. So we can go either other or crops.ds crops types, and then when we create the crop types, the growth stage duration is saved in the first column, so that's column number 0. So we'll give it 0, and the Y column is going to be whatever, so it's whatever the crop type is. And we know what crop type it is because it's already been set up there, so we just go crop type. All right, and finally what we do have to do though, which is something that we do in the instance create crop grid, is we have to add it to the instance grid. So let's just do that actually right here. Let's go ds crops instances, and so now we have to give it the grid X and Y position that it's going to be located at. And we know what that is because that was inputted to us here, so we can use this again. So we can go argument 0, argument 1, that's the X and Y location. And we're going to set that to equal the instance ID, just like we had before. And for fun, how about we also just show debug message, respawned a, and then we're going to add whatever the type is, so that it's going to say like respawned a tomato every time it's respawned something. So, and to do that, let's add something to the crop types grid. So remember, we currently have 2 columns saving data, but let's also add a third one that saves just the name. And because of how we set it up previously, with our script being quite flexible, we should just be able to add all of this. All right, so now the name should be in the third column. So let's come back to here, and we should be able to just pull that out. So we're going to go ds crops types. So that third column, which is column 2, because we're starting at 0. And now the Y row is just going to be the crop type, which we can get from here, argument 2. And actually the very last thing we're going to do down here, we're just going to return the instance. And at the moment we're not using that, but we did that in our instance grid. So we'll do that again here. So that should be all we need. Let's give that a test. So let's go ahead and plant some crops, and I'll press G on those ones so we can get some different number of days. All right, and we'll leave, and then we'll come back in. And so there you go, it's respawned the crops, but the problem is they are currently dirt pits, and that's because when we entered the room, there's nothing telling the crops to be at their current stage. But if you check the debugger, it should actually have been passed its variables correctly. And if I just press G 1 time, you see it's updated them to 1 more day, because we actually had a little updater in when we're pressing the G button. But we should also add this to whenever we're starting the room. So actually, let's just grab all of this right here and let's add it to the room start. And we want to make sure actually that we're inside our if check here. And let's just put that in here for now. We could do it in the script, but I just want to keep them separate for if we change anything later, because we might want to do other stuff in here. So let's just tab this forwards like this, and that should be all we need. All right, let's run the game. And again, let's go plant some crops. So, and grow those a bit. Okay, and let's leave the room and come back in. And there we go, it's working. So this is making the crops persistent. We haven't actually saved their data externally at all. We haven't saved any actual parts of the game. If you quit and reload the game, nothing is saved there. So the next few things that we're going to be doing is the inventory and maybe some more stuff on the NPCs, maybe some text system. We'll also fix the depth issue that a few of you have brought up before. And basically I've just kind of left it because it wasn't essential yet, and I really wanted to get the crops finished first. But it's about time that we address that. So for example, when we're moving in front of an instance like this, and we really should be behind it here, So we're going to be setting up a system that is managing the depth of our objects. So lots to do still, obviously. I'd like to thank everyone on Patreon who are supporting me to create these tutorials, with a special shout out to 3D Monkey Biz and Uthelian. But that's it for today. I hope you guys are well, and I'll see you next time.